Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about a unit that went from absolute treasure in 9th edition to complete trash in 10th. And of course, I'm talking about Howling Banshees. So unlike other aspects who, pretty much either got a side grade or straight up got better in 10th edition, Howling Banshees got worse in almost every way except for their cost, and even then, their cost wasn't reduced enough to justify how badly they were nerfed. And this was already on top of a pretty heavy combat nerf game-wide. And unlike other combat units who have some utility like Harlequins or Striking Scorpions, Howling Banshees just didn't seem to have a role. A lot of people were just looking at Howling Banshees, including myself, and thinking that the unit was just not worth taking in any situation. However, I have been playing them over the last week in a couple games here and there, and while not conclusive evidence that Howling Banshees are good by any stretch of the imagination, I have found a couple of cheeky ways to use them in your games, which might be very effective. And definitely something that threw a lot of my opponents off because, a lot of players out there are now realizing that Howling Banshees are not the powerhouse that they once were. And you can use this to your advantage to play a little bit of Eldar mind games on your opponent. Alright, so what are we going to be looking at in today's video? So we're going to be overviewing the stats, weapons, and special rules of Howling Banshees, their strengths and weaknesses, combos and synergies. We're going to be talking about, is it actually worth it to try to increase their damage output in-game, which is a big question that needs to be addressed. And lastly, the best way to use Howling Banshees in an Eldar army, and how to make the most out of them. And during this time, I will share with you a few tricks to using Howling Banshees, which hopefully will make them much more effective in your games. Now, as some of you guys may remember, I did do a review on Howling Banshees when the edition first came out. However, this is going to be a completely new video with different ideas introduced and different ways to use Howling Banshees that I've actually discovered quite recently. So without further ado, let us get right into it. Alright, so looking at their basic stats, they're pretty fast for infantry at movement 8. This is a rare thing for Eldar infantry on foot, being movement 8 is pretty fast. They are fairly squishy, however, with a 4+ save, but they do get a 4+ invul in combat, which doesn't come up that much, I have to say, but it is still a little bit of extra survivability. And it does allow them to stick in combat a little bit longer than you would normally expect. As far as their melee weapons, this is supposed to be their bread and butter, but as you can see by the stats of the melee weapons themselves, they don't really hit that hard. They each get 3 attacks at strength 4, AP -3, and damage 1, which is good. The AP -3 is great, but the strength 4 has trouble wounding most targets. The Exarch, who was, basically the gem of the Eldar Codex in 9th edition, has been severely hit. The Executioner, while, powerful at damage 2, only has AP -2, regardless of its strength 5, and of course only has 1 more attack over the regular Howling Banshees. Mirror Swords are basically 2 Banshee Blades, double the attacks, but no higher stats. And the Triskele is much weaker at strength 3, AP -2, 5 attacks, but also does have a ranged attack, which is pretty decent. As far as their ranged weapons go, of course, they are armed with shuriken pistols, which might get you an extra wound here and there and can fire in close combat, which, rarely does come up, I have to say. And the Triskele, of course. So, a quick note about the Triskele. In the very beginning of the edition, I said that this was probably the weapon option to go with these girls, but I'm a little bit torn between this and the Executioner. I really do like the fact that the Executioner just does 2 flat damage against things like Space Marines. That is still very good, especially with, the hit reroll and the wound reroll we get via our detachment bonus. So it's a little bit of a toss-up. Triskele or Executioner are probably the way to go. But over the past week when I've been playing the Howling Banshees, I have to say I've tried both loadouts. I'm a little bit of a bigger fan of the Executioner just because you can threaten tougher targets with it and get, more consistent damage against mech targets. As far as their abilities go, this is really where I think they got hit the hardest in the change to the edition because Fights First is a much weaker effect now. They used to make enemies fight last. Fights First is much weaker. However, it is useful in subsequent rounds of combat or when they're charged. Normally, this is not going to happen with the current mindset that we have about Howling Banshees coming from 9th edition. But, believe it or not, it might actually come in handy with how we're going to be thinking about using them currently. They can also advance and fall back and declare a charge in the same turn, which is very useful. And it means that if enemies, your opponent wants to tie them up with something cheap and, not so powerful, it might come to bite them in the ass. As far as their wargear options go, the Exarch can take the Mirror Swords, Executioner, or Triskele, but again, like I said, I think the Mirror Swords are pretty much garbage. The Executioner or Triskele is where it's at. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, what about the Mirror Swords with things like Doom and a Falcon, right? Because you get a reroll the wounds and you get +1 to wound. Yes, true. I think the damage of the Mirror Swords does go up when you consider that, but you are investing at that point a lot into your Howling Banshees, and as I'll explain later in this video, that might not actually be the best way to use them, or think about using them in your games. And coming to the unit composition, the reason why I said that is because they are kind of already a little bit pricey, right? 85 points for 5, 170 for 10, which is on the expensive side of elite infantry, right? Considering their damage output. If this was Fire Dragons, there's a reason why Fire Dragons are 85 points, right? They can melt tanks, they can melt heavy armor, they are very damaging. Howling Banshees, on the other hand, really aren't. They don't get any bonuses to wound base, they don't have it built into their profiles or abilities, so they really rely on either outside help or just basically they can't go after heavier targets. However, they do have the benefit of the infantry keyword, so can easily move through ruins and terrain, which makes them very mobile, especially since they have movement 8 and the ability to advance and charge, and also, fall back and charge if they do get hit in close combat. All right, so what are their strengths and weaknesses? So first of all, their strengths are they are very fast and have a massive threat range for infantry, pretty much on a higher level than Harlequins. And Harlequins do have a pretty big threat range, especially out of a Starweaver or a Transport, right? So Howling Banshees have an even greater threat range than they do base. Harlequins, of course, are cheaper and have that +1 to wound built into their profile on charge, but they don't have the threat range that Howling Banshees do. Howling Banshees also have pretty high AP on their attacks, so they're able to deal with power armor, things like that, pretty easily if they can wound. Their weaknesses, however, are that they don't hit that hard, and I think this is really where people kind of are bummed out about them, because against most mech targets, they're wounding on 4s, they're hitting on 3s, they're not really doing that much damage at the end of the day. And believe it or not, if they go up head-to-head against a unit of intercessors, they don't actually trade that well with them. So, to give you a quick example of this, unless you're lucky with the Exarch and you're taking the Executioner, which, you could very well get lucky with it and your opponent can fail those 5-ups, the unit will only kill about 3 to 4 of them on charge. And then, of course, inevitably, those intercessors will fall back and they will be shot to pieces. So you're really not getting your points worth out of those Howling Banshees unless you eliminate the unit altogether. And oftentimes, they just don't have the hitting power to do that anymore. They are also very fragile, like I stated, and Fights First isn't that useful on them if you charge in and use them for a straight-up assault. And lastly, they need a transport. Or do they? And I say that with all seriousness because at the beginning of the edition, I was pretty convinced that Howling Banshees needed either a Wave Serpent or a Falcon to operate effectively, but I don't think that's any longer the case. Because, of course, of the changes to Overwatch and various other things that have happened in the game, I actually think it might be better to just run these girls on foot or from reserve. All right, so let's talk about some possible combos and synergies, because I know some of you will probably talk about these in the comment section that you've had some success boosting their damage to respectable levels with either Doom or a Falcon. So Doom gives them +1 to wound, and of course a Falcon can give them rerolls to wound, which is pretty good, right? I mean, a Falcon, if they drop out of a Falcon, the Falcon shoots a unit of intercessors with a shuriken cannon. They will go in, they will reroll wounds, and most likely will slaughter the entire unit. However, at that point, you are investing in a Falcon, and I think there are better units in a Falcon, like Fire Dragons, which cost the same exact points. And actually, even against intercessors, do about the same amount of damage as Howling Banshees, just because fusion guns wreck face so hard. Jane Czar can also give them +1 to hit and a free heroic intervention, but, like stated before, the free heroic intervention It's a good stratagem, just maybe not that good on Howling Banshees because, of course, you can just shoot them to death because they're so fragile. Heroic Intervention is typically better on tougher units like Wraith Lords, which can obviously be used to defend more fragile units from close combat. All right, now here's the biggest question, here's the biggest argument that I think could be derived from the usefulness of Howling Banshees, and that is it actually worth it to try to increase their damage output in-game or in your list? And I have to say, I don't think it is. And the reason why is because I think investing anything more than their already slightly higher base cost is too much for what they're actually good at doing, which is not dealing a lot of damage. And yes, I know that might seem weird for me to say because Howling Banshees on paper look like a damage dealing unit. But because of their abilities and just, kind of how they've been reworked in 10th edition and how the edition is run so far, I actually don't think that's the best way to use them. Therefore, I don't think investing in their damage is really worth it. And I've actually been doing something over the past few games with them that has reversed my mindset on how to use them. And basically, I went into it with this mindset. Howling Banshees on paper don't do a lot of damage, so I'm not going to expect them to do a lot of damage. I'm going to use them for a different purpose. And the one thing that came to my mind, which is something people have been saying in the comments over and over and over again, Proxy Hammer, why don't you talk about Rapid Ingress? Rapid Ingress. Proxy Hammer, what about Rapid Ingress? Right? People have been asking about this stratagem for a while, and the reason I haven't done a video on it is simply because it's extremely situational, and it really depends on what your opponent is doing. And in my opinion, it is really a reactive stratagem. It is reactive based on where your opponent goes on the board, and it's not always going to be useful. However, what I have learned with Howling Banshees is that because they're a very small infantry unit that is easy to place and hide for the stratagem, they're actually a perfect candidate for it, unlike things like Shining Spears, which have a large footprint. And of course, are very unmaneuverable. Weirdly so, because you think Shining Spears would be more maneuverable, but because of the fly and mounted keyword interaction, in ruins and stuff, they're really not as maneuverable as you might think. Rapid Ingress is a less useful stratagem, in my mind, on a unit like Shining Spears, and it's much better on a smaller unit like Howling Banshees. You don't really see this used on Striking Scorpions and, things like Harlequins because they have better deployment options, right? Harlequins can be taken in the Starweaver, which is usually a much better way of moving them about the board, and Striking Scorpions have Infiltrate. But Howling Banshees have the benefit of both being, small in footprint and having a massive threat range and can move easily through ruins because of the infantry keyword. So when they are placed, they can threaten a lot of stuff on the battlefield. And yeah, they don't do a whole bunch of damage for their points, but they can be unexpectedly used to throw off your opponent's target priority or bait long charges. And yes, against combat armies that really don't have a lot of shooting, you put these Banshees, you put these girls right outside of 9 inches of an opponent that is going to charge into you. And sometimes you can bait an opponent into using a charge against them. And of course, Howling Banshees have fights first, so they get to strike before the enemy does. I have used this ability successfully against things like Assault Intercessors, where, the Howling Banshees are out of line of sight of the enemy army, but the Assault Intercessors might have a charge on them. Now, your opponent normally in this situation may or may not actually succeed in getting the charge off, because after all, they do need a 9. But what your opponent might think is, well, I don't have anything to lose by trying. Of course, as we know, they have a lot to lose by trying. And if they do succeed, which it actually did succeed in one of my games, my opponent thought they got really lucky, rolled that 9, charged right into the Howling Banshees, and got cut down. Because of course, Howling Banshees have fights first. So it charged in, I had fights first, and even though they don't do a ton of damage, they're not the, Supremos they were last edition, they did enough damage to where, he could only really realistically kill one Howling Banshee back. And I had successfully neutralized the threat that my opponent was going to, use to, destroy Rangers or destroy other units that could now basically be free to score secondaries and expand my control on the board. So they can be a great bait unit to bait out a long charge from your opponent. Now, will this work against really high-skilled players? Maybe not. Maybe your opponent won't take the bait. But if your opponent doesn't take the bait, you get a free unit deployed in a position that is advantageous to you. So it's a win-win, right? And as Eldar players, we're always looking for these win-win scenarios where, no matter what decision an opponent makes, it's good for you. But even if your opponent doesn't take that bait and doesn't have that opportunity available for you to exploit, Howling Banshees using Rapid Ingress can threaten support units, they can threaten backline units, things like Storm Hostile Objective or Capture Enemy Outpost are suddenly, within your reach because Howling Banshees, while not super damaging, can actually kill smaller units that are isolated, especially with assistance. So, using things like Swooping Hawks in conjunction with Howling Banshees to raid your opponent's backlines can be a very easy way of sweeping out some, weaker units in your opponent's deployment zone. My favorite thing is actually to put these girls in reserve and use them to threaten weaker infantry in the opponent's backlines, things like cultists and Gretchen that your opponent, basically just throws back there in order to guard an objective. However, Howling Banshees are good enough to deal with these targets in close combat. Cultists are very easy to kill for Howling Banshees. Even the pistols can down a couple of them because they're light infantry. And Howling Banshees have no trouble wounding targets like cultists, unlike, Marine equivalents. So oftentimes can just sweep through those units and score objective points very easily. So with that being said, Howling Banshees are also relatively expendable, right? If you just spend 85 points on them and you don't invest a bunch of transport costs in them, you don't buy a Falcon for them, you don't invest in Doom via Eldrad, they're relatively expendable, and they also can't really be ignored altogether, right? Your opponent can't ignore them like you can ignore things like cultists, because Howling Banshees actually do damage, They don't do a lot of damage, but they can threaten a wide variety of units on the battlefield. And when I say threaten, I don't necessarily mean deal damage, but maybe just tie them up for a couple of key turns so they either can't score secondaries or they can't move their other units around it, right? Howling Banshees, because they're a combat unit, are really good at mucking up targets in the midfield and preventing your opponent from being able to move throughout the battlefield normally. And because, of course, we're Eldar, we can take advantage of these moments because we have an army with incredible amounts of speed, and this can open up different opportunities for us to just basically dominate the board in other areas. Okay, so what is the best way to use Howling Banshees in an Eldar army, and how do you make the most out of them? So Howling Banshees are a disruption unit. They're no longer the, elimination unit that they were in 9th edition. They are a disruption unit best at using their high mobility combined with things like Rapid Ingress to place themselves in inconvenient positions for your opponent. And from there, they can either pounce on vulnerable targets and score on objectives like Storm Hostile Objective or Capture Enemy Outpost, which, by the way, guys, if you're playing tactical objectives, you guys know that drawing that on turn 1 and 2, if you draw it on turn 1, you're probably not going to be able to score it anyway. But if you draw it on turn 2, there's a good chance if your opponent leaves it open, Howling Banshees can take it, which is pretty cool. And by the way, if your opponent leaves something like a Rhino on the backfield or something like that on the backfield objective, Howling Banshees can definitely take it out. It's definitely possible for them to, maybe not kill it. Obviously, they're not going to destroy it, right? But they are going to be able to, have the objective control of 5 to be able to beat the Rhino's 3. I think a Rhino is maybe 2, actually, excuse me. But, there's enough bodies there to where you can actually take the objective from your opponent, which is obviously going to force your opponent to have to deal with the Banshees. And now, there's a big problem in your opponent's backfield, which, again, helps you win the game in the long run. Also, they can mess with your opponent's target priorities and even tie up key units. So really expensive units that your opponent really doesn't want in combat, Howling Banshees can be thrown in there, and they can be a good way to, kind of tie those units up and hold your opponent's assets away from your own key units, right? So your fragile units that really need to survive into the game, deep into the game, to be able to score on secondaries, destroy enemy units, things like that, you can tie those up early on and make it really hard for your opponent to be able to deal with them. All right, so in conclusion, while last edition they were the premier melee damage unit in our roster, their role has significantly changed, and we have to change our mindset about this. I don't think Banshees are going to get their damage back, right? It's gone. It's probably gone for good. But, could we expect a bit of a points decrease? Of course. I think even with this new role that I've kind of seen them in, I think they should be probably about 75 points, maybe 70. And that's, considering they are being used as a disruption and utility melee unit, aside from, just dealing damage. Because again, like I said, I really don't think they compete well with the other units in our index in a damage sense. So, obviously striking Scorpions, Harlequins hit much harder than Howling Banshees in close combat for cheaper. So I don't think Howling Banshees should be thought of in that way. They really should be seen more as a unit that is going to, again, strike vulnerable positions in your opponent's lines and block stuff up, block off key units from being able to do what they need to do. And I do think that it is essential that they be kept in reserve, waiting for opportunities to use things like rapid ingress, or, if your opponent really doesn't give you a rapid ingress opportunity, at least be able to come in from reserve and threaten things on the board. So your opponent's going to have to constantly think about them coming in, and it is going to be a considerable stress on your opponent. And in that way, they can really make up their value. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you guys think of Howling Banshees, how you've been running them, if you've been running them like this in your games. I've recently kind of discovered this myself. Many of you may already have. So let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say as a community. Lastly, I am going to be covering the nerfs that are coming up. So we're going to see nerfs within the next week or so. I am going to be covering those heavily, so stay tuned for that within the next week. And last update, I am going to lightly cover Old World. I think I'll probably cover Dwarfs. I'll probably cover the rules at some point, just lightly, and maybe Wood Elves and High Elves as well, just to give you guys kind of a taste of that. Just, talking about my opinions about them and stuff like that. I'm not a pro fantasy player. I played a little bit competitively back in the day when fantasy was around, but I really haven't given it much thought since they canned the game. So, obviously there's a lot of content creators out there creating great Old World content that, I have watched myself in the last couple of days and enjoyed. Great Book of Grudges, I think, has put out some great stuff. If you're interested in Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer Old World stuff, I would definitely check that out. But over the next week, at some point, I will be giving you guys just, my initial thoughts on the release and, the different army books and armies and stuff like that. So stay tuned for that. And without further ado, I want to thank my patrons once again for all the support they have given over the last year. You've helped the channel grow immensely and helped it really just blossom into what it has become today. So thank you so much for that continuous support. And if you do want to join, the channel Patreon and become a supporter or support the channel, I do have free trials activated. So that means that, you don't have to pay a thing, but you do get access to our, channel's Discord, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who like talking about strategies, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I am also quite active on the Discord, so if you want to hit up a conversation with me, talk strategy, talk shop, I will be available to you pretty much anytime, except of course when I'm sleeping. So definitely hit me up on Discord if you want to join that. You do have to join a Patreon free trial, but again, it's free. So as long as you cancel it, it won't cost anything to you. And lastly, I am also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel to rep your local game store or some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, I will leave those links in the description as well, along with my Patreon. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Peace out and have some great games this week. See you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody.